For this episode, we are here with Sheri, Lynn, DeMaris, our guest. Sheri is a macrobiotic diet expert, a documentary film producer, and the host of the TV series Macro Magic. We're going to cover a range of health and wellness topics that may help improve your life. Sheri, welcome.
Thank you.
We are going to start with some highlights on the who, when, where, and what of you and your career. So, where'd you grow up?
I grew up in Cherry Hill, New Jersey, and my mom was really into yoga and juicing. She read a lot of spiritual books, and my dad was very steak and potatoes person, so.
It's a balance, right?
Yes,
and
yes.
what did you take from that? Were you able to sort of navigate the difference? Because those are classic different mentalities in how America has been raised. You had an experience that's not totally unusual.
Yes, and we were known as, on our block as, don't go over Sheri's house. Her mom will give you carrot juice with celery ice cubes and all sorts of, plant-based foods. So I basically grew up with those plant-based foods. But then when I went away to college, I sort of forgot how to cook them and eat them until I was at graduate school at the College of William and Mary, and they had a food co-op, which I joined because I couldn't afford to buy food. And that's where I started getting into using grains and beans and vegetables. And I worked in the Colonial Village in Williamsburg, and I was barmaid at the Chinese Tavern, and I'd take home the big used cherry jars and fill them up with beans. I didn't know how to cook them, but I just sort of put them all in my house and decorated my kitchen with them.
That's great. So was that one of your first jobs then too, or there were some? I'm always curious about people like in high school, for example, before you went off to college. What were some of the early jobs that you remember?
Oh gosh, in high school, I was really into athletics, so I did a lot of, just volunteer work at the school, but I also, I worked at a steakhouse. I was a hostess, and I had to tell people, push the cart around and ask what kind of steak they wanted. And that was one of my first jobs. And then I worked at the Flanders Hotel for 4 years.
Stay with me
summer.
on the steaks for a second, because the macrobiotic diet is mostly plant-based with some fish,
Yes.
right? It's kind of ironic. You started with the big red meat. I do want to cover, and we'll get into some of the diet and properties of nutrients, because I do believe some grass-fed red meat has become increasingly popular for people that are looking at the vitamin B12s, all those things. So I don't want to dismiss any particular food, but since the focus of today is really macrobiotic advantages, it's just funny that you're pushing the meat cart back in the day. Okay, with mantras, I'd love to hear, are there some things, some sort of like points of wisdom that capture not just the food, but the lifestyle that you've sort of developed and cultivated over the years?
So I, within the last 2 years, developed an online, totally virtual cooking school with 4 levels, and it's called the Macrobiotic Global Institute. So we look globally as to how to teach people in different cultures. So I paired up with Patricio Garcia de Paredes. He was originally the person in Tokyo that ran the macrobiotic school there for years in person. And when COVID hit, we both went virtual. So we used a lot of his teaching materials, and we developed cooking videos to match them and recipes. And so he teaches a lot in Malaysia, China, all areas close to him, and I teach mostly in the United States. So together, we're hoping to build more of a global network and understand different cultures and how they cooked, and then teach them a little bit more sustainability and how to cook more from the garden and how to use some of their traditional foods, especially fermented foods, to help improve their health.
I love that. So the mantra that would come from what I'm hearing is really about connectivity for information, right? That sometimes we get stuck, I believe, in pockets of knowledge. So like the food pyramid, for example, from the I guess it was like the 50s and 60s, right? We've learned now, not so great when you had like giant loaves of white bread on the table, right? The simple carbs and all kinds of maybe overkill of dairy. Like what I'm getting at is I'm hearing a mantra that's about learning and connecting multicultural, that we can't just assume that like the US Food and Drug Administration has the answers.
Exactly.
Asia, all these rich cultures for thousands of years. So
ironically, Michio Kushi, who pretty much brought macrobiotics to the U.S., created a typical standard food pyramid when he was working, especially with people struggling with health issues. And Walter Willett at Harvard helped develop that and use it as their standard, moving dairy and animal food more to the top of the pyramid and whole grains, plant-based foods to the bottom. And then they developed pyramids for each culture. So you have a Mediterranean diet pyramid, you have, according to the climate where you live, using those fruits, vegetables, beans, grains that grow in that area are most important to consider.
And I love this as a setup because I want to make sure a lot of our audience is familiar with the macrobiotic diet, the fundamental principles. But the reference you made about local, to me, is such an incredible driver that it's not like some definitive path is right for every person in every place. Mm-hmm. It's about local. So share the kind of high-level definition just to put it on the table for a macrobiotic diet.
Well, we really stress local and we stress seasonal because you're not separate from your environment. As you and I know, so many things have removed people from the environment. We're indoors more, we're driving in cars, we're away from trees and grass and our gardens. So it's very disconcerting to the body because the body wants to always bring back into balance when you're outside, you're one with the environment. So if you're living in a very cold climate, eating tropical fruits and vegetables, you'll get cold inside, you'll get chilled. Versus if you're in a very warm climate, eating, long cooked food and foods that's grown more in the New England states, you're going to feel overheated, and your body just needs to adjust to whatever climate and season that you're in.
It's so interesting. So when we hear about blue foods, like for example the blueberries and the eggplant and the blue potatoes, like I love that those can have some nutritional value, but what you're saying is maybe those blackberries or those blueberries with the antioxidants aren't great for someone that's living in a very cold environment for
Well, not only
reasons.
that, your garden will tell you what you need, because if it's growing that season, like we're moving into berry and melon season right now, but we don't typically eat them in the fall when it's harvest time. We eat more pumpkins and root vegetables and warming vegetables as the season gets colder and colder. So your body just adapts better if you're in line, in sync with the seasons and where you live.
You said something so interesting, that the garden tells you what to eat, right? So if it's something that's flown in, and we have this unbelievable opportunity with grocery stores now where you go down the aisles year round, and if a child were to go there not knowing where food comes from, you would think that all the bounty of the earth is available at your fingertips.
Yeah, that's the problem.
Everywhere in America.
Yeah, that's
everywhere in
the
the world.
problem now. And because we've grown so much, you and I were talking about, farming has grown to an industrial level. We're confused, and we're also extremely sick. Highly processed foods are very difficult for the digestive tract to break down.
Well, let's touch on that, because I know with the health issues with diabetes, with over 20% of the children now in the United States are clinically obese, that leads to 40% obesity for adults. Not 2% going to 4%, right? Really big, scary numbers. This multi-trillion-dollar health care budget is, like, at a national level, unsustainable. We know that with Social Security, with all these other problems. So I think that the green movement and macrobiotic diets being part of that green movement since the 70s kind of got a bad rap as being like a liberal cause, and for like tree huggers or people that were like sensitive to like oh, the polar bear may slip off the ice or the spotted owls. I'm like, let's talk about money. Let's talk about like we are wasting taking care of people with statins. And I'll go on my little rant as much as I like pharma, with like a Lipitor is apparently the number one selling drug in the world to reduce cholesterol. Well, let's eat better food that doesn't create the need for Lipitor, right? So what you're saying with the garden giving us guidance is so interesting to me, because I had always thought, and this was even up until we started talking minutes ago, that those blue foods were great for everyone. That the blueberries were just a good part of a diet, and probiotics with, say, a Greek yogurt and a prebiotic with like a sauerkraut that's fermented, that doesn't have the preservatives, right? It's alive,
Mm-hmm.
would be good. But what you're saying, it sounds like, is there's differences. We should be much more tuned.
Well, there's so much, you mentioned prebiotics, there's so much research out there now, and so many doctors are acknowledging the benefits of prebiotics and probiotics. So in macrobiotics, the prebiotics are the whole grains. That's what the probiotics have to feed off of in your gut. So if you have enough whole grains, and especially fiber from vegetables, that serves as the food for the probiotics. So the probiotics are more of the fermented foods. So they're the sauerkraut. We make a lot of different pickles. We use miso. We use shoyu, which is naturally fermented soy sauce, or tamari if you're gluten intolerant, and natto. All these fermented foods, which a lot of them were developed in Japan, but many cultures around the world developed their own fermented foods. If you go to India, they make dal and they let it sit and ferment. In Czechoslovakia, they have all sorts of thousands of pickles. So each culture had their fermented foods, and each culture was basically plant-based. If you read the Blue Zones, all around the world. And when they ate animal food, they ate very small amounts, and they knew how to balance it with lots of vegetables or slow cook it in a way. And it wasn't massive amounts like we see now. Colin Campbell's oftentimes on my TV show. He's the author of the China Study. And he explains that there's protein in every food. And we became protein fanatic after World War II, obsessed with the fact that we needed more protein. However, if I've been on a plant-based diet for almost my entire life. It's been like 50 years now, and I don't have any health issues.
Fish a little bit with the pescatarian side.
Yeah, so you can make a choice with that. However, many people are choosing not to, like myself, only because of the pollution problem with the fish.
Stay with me for a second on the fermentation, because I had thought, and again, this is all about learning for me as well as the audience, that the Greek yogurt had the probiotics, but that the sauerkraut without the vinegar or preservatives had a prebiotic. Are they actually both probiotic?
Yeah, so the problem with dairy food when you ferment it is it has casein in it, first of all. So casein is an animal protein, again, if you read the China Study, that promotes cancer growth in the body. We always say, with animal food and dairy food, keep it under 20%. If you go over 20%, you're going to end up with serious health conditions. One, because there's no fiber at all in dairy food. And two, because of the casein. I've worked with so many people with breast cancer and various types of cancer. As soon as that casein level goes up, their markers starting to increase. So it's more that animal protein that our body doesn't really know what to do with. Like I said, the milk, from cows was made for baby cows. So it's got a ratio of calcium and magnesium that's off, and it's not similar to mother's milk.
Well, they say, and this is pretty simple for people to understand, that milk is a great food for a baby cow. It's not necessarily designed for a human baby or a human adult. Right. Interesting. I know with 80-20, I've been about that 80-20 plant-based to other, animal, fish, and proteins. But the interesting thing about sequencing, I found in reference to grains, is like a quinoa-infused brown rice or wild rice. A prebiotic then to go with something like that. Share with me how to sequence food in meals? Because that's been a mystery.
It's not so much sequencing, but to make sure that at least 3 times a week or 4 times a week you have a tablespoon of fermented pickle. So it could be sauerkraut, it could be anything that's salt brine pickle, not the high vinegar chemicalized pickles, because that has the live enzymes on it that actually go into your gut. Our gut is made of billions and billions and billions of bacteria.
Like a big unknown.
Yes.
There's probably, we know more about the undersea and outer space maybe than our own microbiome,
Exactly.
right?
So our microbiome is really in our house, in our backyard, and what's happened is because we've sprayed our soil so much and turned it into inert dirt, dead dirt, not a living being anymore, and we've taken so many, antibiotics and chemicals into our system, it's completely burned out the inside lining of our gut. And so many people, we were talking about processed foods. When you go to a laboratory and you make a candy bar, they're not putting real lemon flavor in your candy bar anymore. They're putting drops of all these chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
So, and then they ultra process it, and they don't, naturally cook it, but they ultra process it. So your digestive tract doesn't know what to do with that. And oftentimes you have tiny little hairs in your villi, in your small intestine. Those villi start to get worn down and you start getting leaky gut. So when you have miso soup, when you have fermented foods, that grows back that strong absorption villi or little hairs to attract the vitamins and minerals into your bloodstream that you need.
Wow.
So when you're eating, potato chips and all these processed foods, that gut lining is going down. And now I'm seeing in young people extreme Crohn's disease, IBS, bleeding from the gut. I mean, it goes on and on and on. Headaches, allergies, all related to that gut lining disappearing.
It's so interesting that if you take that model of like keep it simple, right? Keep it simple, stupid. I didn't know I got onto a macrobiotic diet in 1992, which is coming up on 30 years ago, maybe 31. I worked for a professor from Penn. I was a graduate teacher in Tokyo, and I just had no money to buy the Kobe beef, the really premium meat. And I was basically eating some of the fish, but like 80-90% vegetables and grains. And then came back, had lost from grad school. I was in the like 200 range. I was down to 180 where I am now, like high school, lacrosse team, fighting weight. I didn't think about it as a diet. I thought about it as just balance and a lifestyle meal planning approach. I think what happens sometimes is with Atkins diets or the ketogenic and trends, and I sometimes will do some intermittent fasting almost by accident if I rush out the door and don't have like a full breakfast. But like there's so many fads and trends, and the YouTube content is overwhelming. What I love hearing today, and we'll have hopefully more discussions, that you'll be a repeat guest, is that the macrobiotic diet is more of a macrobiotic lifestyle than just what people use in the word diet.
Yeah, we
You
don't
wanna
like
live
to
with
say, we never like to say cut out either. We like to say add. So if you're not used to any of these foods, just add a little oatmeal every week, or add a little brown rice, or even if you're eating out all the time, choose a plant-based dish from a good quality restaurant. And watch the oil, by the way, because most restaurants use bad quality oil, which is really harmful right now.
We're learning so much about that too, with also there's some food fraud where like apparently over half of the quote virgin olive oil on the market is like just not even close. Share with the group here one of your meal plans for a day last week. So I'm just curious, like from a breakfast and a lunch and dinner, some snacks. Is there one particular day that maybe is a kind of an example that could inspire others?
Yeah, real simple. Like I mentioned, oatmeal, cracked oats or oat flakes are a little bit easier to cook than whole oats. Like whole oats we use more in the wintertime. So it'd be like a bowl of oatmeal with walnuts and some maple syrup. And we always do a grain and a green together.
Grain and a green.
Yeah, I
Good
know
to
it sounds
remember.
funny, but for breakfast even, we always have vegetables with grains because they complement, they sort of balance it out. If you just eat strictly grain, you get super tight inside because grains are very contracting, what we call yang. They're very yang in the body. So vegetables complement grains. So I would have a bowl of oatmeal with the maple syrup and the walnuts and maybe some steamed broccoli.
And that's a breakfast.
Yeah.
So, by the way, I'm going to jump right into this because I learned from Japan that was very common, that you'd have a mix of things. And it was even sometimes there'd be some seafood, maybe it was a little slice, just a flavor from the salmon or the tuna with rice and then with the broth and it was in tea. I think America may be the only country in the world that eats dessert for breakfast.
Yes.
Right, like the Belgian
The
waffle,
sweets.
I believe, was designed as a dessert. We eat waffles, right, sometimes for breakfast. So
Well,
we've changed.
You have to remember that your stomach layers. So when you start your meal, it's very important to have a soup relaxes and opens up your stomach. But it's very important to start off with more contracting foods like salt or miso or grain to start the meal, and then finish the meal with dessert or a green salad because your stomach layers. So if you start a meal with chocolate or something, you'll feel immediately not hungry, but you'll get indigestion from layering that extremely expanded food with something contracting on top.
Other breakfast veggies, like this is going to be a shock for some of the people that are just joining in to listen, but no one in America is waking up thinking like, which broccoli, floret should I put in with my oatmeal? Like that's an anomaly.
Well, see, that's sort of somebody who's been doing it for 40 years. But again, we encourage people because you know what they always use. I was a guidance counselor for 40 years, and I had a garden to plate program, and the principals at the school would always mock me and say, what is Miss DeMaris eating for Thanksgiving this year or whatever. But it was interesting for me to see that once we all became of age and some of them had heart issues, they'd come back to me and say, my doctor's telling me now to have oatmeal every morning for breakfast because oatmeal is a wonderful food that balances out your cholesterol level. Not only gives you fiber, lots of B vitamins. So I wasn't that off base.
Oh no, it's great.
I got teased a lot throughout my whole life, but I wasn't that off base. Stay with me on
the steel cut versus like the quick. There's the we're not going to throw Quaker Oats under the bus, but there's packages where you can just add water or milk and throw it in the microwave. Is the nutritional value of those just so dramatically less than a true steel cut?
Oh yeah,
oatmeal?
so
it's kind of a waste of time.
I wrote a book for kids and parents called Macro Magic. And in the book, like a lot of adults use it because it's a good beginner book, I explain how they industrialize grains. So they started with whole grains, post cereal, all these General Mills, and then they started cracking them. So then we had bulgur wheat and cracked oats. Then they started making them into flakes. Then they started putting them in boxes and putting sugar on them for cereal. So we've come all the way from whole grains to highly processed
Doesn't
grains
even look
with
like
sugar.
what it started with.
Exactly. And if you talk to your parent, like my parents when they grew up only had one cereal, it was shredded wheat and it did not have sugar on it. When we grew up, we had Lucky Charms and all sorts of Cocoa Puffs and all these sugary laden, and then put sugar on top of it, which was crazy.
Okay, I know with my mother in her 80s, she's got the steel cut oats, and the other thing we have is chia seeds in with the coconut milk, like a pudding. Mm-hmm. Has that been on your list at all? The chia seed pudding
I
for
do
breakfast?
use chia seeds in my desserts. However, I don't use any coconut products because they're not indigenous to this climate.
Thank you. That's interesting. So what would I use then here in southeastern Pennsylvania?
So soy milk, Eden brand soy milk is one of the best soy milks because they cook it with kombu seaweed, and kombu seaweed puts minerals back into the soybeans so you can digest them. A lot of plant-based milks are more acidic to the blood. That's not to say, almond milk occasionally, but read the package, look at the ingredients. You don't want anything added to it other than almonds and water.
Now almonds, the challenge for a lot of people too is if you really dig deep, the almonds use so much water per like pound of the nutrients. It's the
Yeah, it's
bees they have
really
to bring
water.
in, and like there's the whole ecosystem challenge of something like almonds. So same thing with a rich food like an avocado, a superfood. I found that with the microgreens and the things that we're growing with our student farmers, the nonprofit organization, the more local you can do things, the better, and the more you can control it with either the outdoor garden that's in a planter, like raised beds that uses a little less water than like commercial farming, or indoors on windowsill farming.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm glad to see you nod, because it's just like there's no perfect answer, right?
Right. Well, we
subtle.
encourage, that's why I produced this film documentary called The Spirit of Rice, showing how rice is grown in the New England states, simply because we need to go back to gardening in order to restore the health of our microbiome. But also, when you grow something and you pick it out of the ground, it has thousands of more micronutrients than if it's been shipped on a truck and even stayed on your shelf for a couple months.
We've covered in a prior one, the depletion over 7 days. They track like romaine lettuce, which is 90% of it's grown in California, and like Yuma, Arizona. Truck from a pickup to a 18-wheeler to a train to a dispatch center, all the way across the country. They keep them at like high 30s, like 38, 39 degrees, almost freezing. They're losing something like 40 to 47% of their nutrients over that week.
It's crazy. And, to think about all of us having lawns and spraying those lawns so there's no more bees and no more lightning bugs and, no weeds, of course, but all those pesticides going into our drinking water, into our soil, where we could, at least make a couple raised box gardens in our backyard.
Oh, you and I
organic.
are right in there with like reduce the lawn, use ground cover planting, indigenous planting to create habitats for animals. I have with the rain barrels, the edible garden where we're collecting the rainwater and also growing the food that's indigenous. On the Jersey Shore side with the house, it's the blueberries, it's the beach plums, even garlic we plant at the end because that scares away the rabbits. Okay, I want to make this as actionable as possible as we sort of kind of come towards the closing chapter of our interview today. Love for the breakfast, this idea of grains and greens.
Yeah, so we always say grains and greens every meal. So even if you're out and you have a hummus sandwich, have a salad with it or something. Makes it more digestible and more balanced. Then we add grains, greens, and beans to at least one meal a day.
So let's stick with this sample day. So the morning is the like the oats with the maybe it's the broccoli. You have a tea or miso soup or something.
Yeah, you can have miso soup. Usually I just have soup for dinner or lunch.
Okay.
But
So
miso
coffee in
soup
the morning too. Are you a caffeine?
I'm not a coffee drinker.
Blow it up. I don't drink it either. Or the sugar. I mean, by the way, if we don't drink caffeine, it's not terrible to have a couple cups of coffee a day, but like the soda, like we're going to look back in the history of the world and be like, wow, that was not good for anyone, right? Coca-Cola's of the world, making some money, but like not at the lack of
we always
challenge.
say if you have coffee, drink it black. Don't be putting stuff in it because it'll definitely clog up your lymph nodes with, the extreme roasting. Coffee is a very yin expansive bean that's grown, in warmer climates, and then roasted heavily. And sometimes the oils turn rancid, so you have to be careful about that. But when you add any sort of cream or sugar, that is very hard for your lymph system. Your lymph system doesn't have a pump. Your heart has a pump, but your lymph system has to move. And so oftentimes anything fatty gets stuck in your lymph nodes and can cause problems.
OJ would not fall into the regional play for us here in Southeast Pennsylvania, right? Orange juice.
Do use oranges. Oranges are grown sort of like in China, like they're not as tropical as you think. We don't, we always say good, better, best. So best is probably fresh fruit, but good is fruit juices. Fruit juices are more concentrated, that's all.
And what would be a beverage though with your breakfast, if it's not a big
Yeah, we do
glass of
different
milk?
teas, like grain teas. We have barley tea, rice tea, green tea, fennel tea, any of the more mild teas. Not so many, flowery hibiscus teas and stuff, but.
If the macrobiotic range is what, 500 miles is kind of the target for, what defines local?
So local, you need to get your water local. You should always, whether from a spring, make sure to filter it if it comes through your house. Your water should be local. Your salt can come from any place in the world. So looking at salt, we get it from different islands. We use sea salt only, not salt from the ground, not Himalayan salt, because sea salt has so many other trace minerals to it, and it's much lighter, not so strong.
Interesting. Let's jump into lunch. So if we've got the oats with some veggies, the grain and the green, and then there's another grain and green for lunch. What would be an example?
So you can do, I always have my main meal in the afternoon. Like Ben Franklin was sort of macrobiotic. So he said, eat less in the evening. So and I'm retired now. So a main meal would be a soup, a grain like brown rice, or there's thousands of different types of grain like quinoa. And then a side vegetable, and a pickle, and some beans. And then if you want fruit for dessert, or, we make desserts, we only use brown rice syrup, and barley malt. Those are the three lesser, lesser concentrated sugars.
I heard that rice with beans has some 1 + 1 = 3 property.
So if you're suffering from osteoporosis, greens and beans are your best remedy. Or, your teeth have a lot of cavities and problems. Greens and beans are full of minerals. So there's so much minerals in beans and greens, they complement each other and they strengthen. Your bones are made from good quality blood. So if your blood is more alkaline, more full of minerals, it will build or keep stronger bones. So oftentimes people with lymphoma, leukemia, they have very weak bones because of sodas and sugars they've eaten have leached the minerals off their bones.
So I love the idea of the bigger meal before the end of the day. So this idea of like breakfast and then a lunch and a big American style dinner, plop down on the sofa to watch, All in the Family or whatever. It's like that just doesn't work. In the Spanish culture, they would have a bigger lunch and then like a siesta, and they get back to work. It's kind of interesting that there's maybe something good about that. Well, I want to cover the dinner though, because I've seen some studies in like smaller micro meals as you tail towards the end of the day.
Well, it's
snacks that have nuts and
it's really important to eat according to the clock, because the sun affects our digestive ability. So breakfast between 5 and 9 in the morning, lunch between 11 and 1, and dinner between 5 and 7. And do not eat 3 hours before bed. That's your biggest, you'll have tremendous health issues with that, because your liver needs to clean
I was
at
going to say
night.
it's sitting there. So the idea of the sleeping, well, I'll bet there's a chunk of America, and I've been guilty of this a bunch of times, eating late because you ran long in the day and whatever, and then you're clunking down, you're watching some Netflix, and it's a couple episodes you get sucked into, and you realize like your body hasn't been active. You've either been at rest, like on a sofa, or literally in bed. And what I'm hearing is that activity of just even standing, walking, coming out of a bigger lunch is healthier for the digestion.
Yeah, if you have to eat late at night, eat noodles. Noodles are the easiest to digest. Like heavy breads, anything from the oven is the hardest to digest. So baked bread, we never say like eat baked bread right from the oven, like let it sit for a while. So anything hard, dry, and baked is hardest for the digestive tract. But if noodles are very soft and gentle and they sort of dissolve easily, so that's the best late night meal.
So what I'm hearing, and again, I'm going to try and summarize some takeaways just that I heard, because I'm a sponge for learning this, is that the green and grains is really interesting to me, because that's counter to how people thought about putting food, especially breakfast, together. The other is that the garden is a guide. They can start to tell you what's local, what's good in your region. Since people aren't gardening, we're championing, with the agrarian group and the student farmers, this idea of local, and like, we don't have to wait for corporations and the government to provide better food. We can actually grow some things ourselves, indoors, on a windowsill, outside, a front porch, a backyard, whatever it happens to be.
Well, I just wanted to mention what's amazing to me is learning that the microbiome, when you go to make pickles, on our online program we teach cooking. When you go to make pickles in your house, they don't turn out the first time, because we have so much electromagnetic energy in our house with technology. So it takes a while for bacteria to start coming into your house. So when you make pickles for the first time, you've got to keep trying and trying until you've pickled your house. So once you have the microbiome in your house, you're very successful with pickles, but you're also successful with building back the microbiome in your gut. So it goes along the same lines as having a garden. If you have an organic garden using organic soil, making sure maybe you test the soil, making sure there's enough microorganisms in that soil, and you're pulling those plants up all the time, putting your hands in the dirt, which kids used to do for B12, right? Put your hands in the dirt, eat them. We bleach out our vegetables now, so we kill all the microbes on the vegetables. So you pull up your plants from the garden, you make pickles regularly. Your gut or your microbiome is going to heal, and it's going to get stronger, and you're going to be able to digest better.
If I buy the cucumbers and I want to start pickling, give me the hot tips on like what to do. I don't know how to pickle.
Simple as can be. So you take a mason jar, which is 3 cups of water. You add 1 teaspoon of sea salt, and you boil it, because you've got to dissolve the salts in there, and then you cool it down. And you could stick like dill, peppercorns, other vegetables in there. You don't have to just do cucumbers. Put the sliced cucumbers on. You put the jar in a closet or in a cabinet in the dark for 2 to 3 days. You can cover it with some cheesecloth, or just put the lid to the pickle jar a little bit open, because it's got to breathe.
Gotta have air going through, right?
If there's mold that comes up the top, just scoop it off. It's usually not harmful.
Mold would show up on the water or the edge of the glass?
On the top. It might bubble and then turn a little bit white on the top, but it's not.
I can kill you.
And then put the lid on it, shake it, put it in your fridge, and it'll last for like 2 or 3 weeks.
So when has it actually been fermented? Is it in those first 3 days, or is it in the week following?
It continues. So even with sauerkraut, like we teach a real easy way to put sauerkraut, you just mix like a head of cabbage with 3 teaspoons of salt, and massage it till the water comes out, and stuff it into jars. Stuff it really tight into a jar. Leave the jar out in your cabinet, and then stick it in your fridge, but it continues to ferment.
I'm putting a note here. I'm literally writing pickling, and I've got here the cucumbers and the sauerkraut.
There's a recipe in my cookbook.
That's awesome.
For you.
I have been blown away that at the organic food markets, the cost of the pickled, whether it's cucumbers or the sauerkraut, without the vinegar and the preservatives. I mean, you can find it at the grocery store, and it's relatively affordable.
So kimchi is very popular now. And if you there's some good brands out there. Real Pickle it uses really clean ingredients. Sunjin kimchi is a really good quality kimchi.
Oh, I'm gonna make it. I'm saying that even buying those, like, I like the idea what you were talking about, the simplicity, having grown the microgreens and having gardens, of like doing things that empower people to then share it. And I've showed up to friends' dinner parties with like a bottle of wine and the microgreens. I'm going to start showing up if I do this, right? With the pickle, and tell the story, because I use it as an excuse to talk about health. And I grow superfood. Well, this is the microgreens. Like, I might have to think of a line about something fermenting.
Fermenting. Well, there's all these products that were traditionally created in Japan. You can start making in your own kitchen. We make tofu, tempeh. Sourdough bread. Sourdough bread is another fermented food that's wonderful for you. All these foods we're going to have to start learning how to make on our own, because eventually we're going to end up with a food shortage on this planet. And we're gonna have to start growing our own food and creating our own fermented foods.
Well,
in our
COVID woke us up
kitchens.
to the food storage and the supply chain, not just storing in the grocery stores because it was off the shelf, but how you get it from A to B. And then we've recently seen some of the inflationary issues with just the cost. So I think we are at the right arc in time to say, you know what, for health, let's cut this crazy big expense with healthcare and try and pay a farmer versus paying a doctor, and grow some ourselves and be more conscious of where we are on Earth and where we are in our lives and the time of day and seasonality.
Mm-hmm.
Sheri, this has been
more practical.
just tremendous. A fire hose of information. We're going to have you back if you'd like to come and share more, because I feel like we've just got the tip of an iceberg here to tell a story.
Yeah, and I also wanted to mention kids. If you're having trouble, getting your kids to eat healthy, bring them into the kitchen. Have them make some pancakes that are more natural. Have them make, all these fun foods, and they will start to put them in the garden and have them help you harvest and bring it into the kitchen. They get so excited. I've had kids on my TV shows, just sitting in the kitchen helping us make desserts that are healthy for them.
I'm putting a big note here because Student Farmers is focused mostly on the cultivation of the plants.
Mm-hmm.
We have recipes, but I think starting to get some videos together of kids engaged with the cooking is the catalyst, because that's the end game, right? Just growing the foods is the start of the game. The end game is getting to eat them and feeling better and having some of that before and after, to really talk to children as well as adults about how they feel better.
Yeah, we have to educate our young people because we're leaving them with a planet that's in a mess, terrible mess, and they need, some tools to get by, especially with all these pandemics and things coming up.
Fair, very fair, and I think if we bring it down to that KISS model of keeping it simple and the idea of the garden, getting you some information, being a garden as a guide, and the grains and the greens. I love it. Sheri, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. It's been such a pleasure, and I really appreciate all your work and enjoyed having you on my show as well.
Thank you.